Welcome to The World, Ideas in Practice, a monthly podcast bringing you conversation, insights, and different perspectives on important international issues as we engage with scholars, activists, and practitioners in government and in business. This podcast is a program of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council, a nonprofit, nonpartisan forum for education and engagement on world affairs, and a member of the World Affairs Councils of America. Our partner in this enterprise is the Pikes Peak Library District in Colorado Springs. I'm Sky Forrester, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Ray Raymond. And our focus today is on Iran. This is the first of a two-part series, and we're delighted to have with us Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, an award-winning author, and the 2010 recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. His latest book is Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Trita will speak at the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council on September 7th as we return to in-person programming, and as the topic will be US-Iranian relations after the election. Will there be war or peace? Always a provocative title, Trita. It's great to have you with us for this conversation, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Colorado Springs.
I look forward to coming out there. It's been quite some time, and the idea of doing an in-person event excites me tremendously.
I think it excites all of us. It's been a long time coming. This is the first of a two-part podcast conversation with Trita. In our next conversation, we will explore the future of US-Iranian relations, but a lot has happened in Iran this year that we need to understand. On June 18th, Ebrahim Raisi, former Chief Justice of Iran, was elected President of Iran in a record-setting election. The record because it was the lowest turnout in Iran's electoral history. So, Trita, start us off with, who is Raisi and what does his election portend?
Ebrahim Raisi is a person who made his career within the Iranian judiciary and has really been an unremarkable person throughout his career. He has risen to the top because of a very close alliance and being a very pliant supporter and ally of the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He lost the election to Rouhani back in 2017 in a rather embarrassing way. He only got 15 million votes. Rouhani got about 25 million votes. And he has been rumored to be the person that Khamenei favors to become the next supreme leader. The loss in 2017 was, as a result, a problem, because if he wanted to become supreme leader, he needed to have some sign of public support and legitimacy. So winning this election seemed to have been tremendously important if the plan is to make him this next supreme leader, which may also explain why the hardliners went to such great lengths to manipulate the elections to ensure that there not only would be a victory for Raisi, but that it would be a rather overwhelming victory for Raisi. At the expense, however, of voter participation, which was something that they clearly seemed to be willing to accept, having made the argument for decades that high participation in the elections is a sign of the legitimacy of the system. Now they started to make arguments that the legitimacy of the system comes from God, not from voter participation.
Change the answer instead of the question, right?
Exactly.
Ray.
Trita, can I follow up on that and just ask you, do you think Raisi is merely a tool of the Iranian theocrats, or is there maybe more to him than that?
I think it remains to be seen. I think it's quite clear that till this point, he has largely been a pliant tool. Not to say that he's lacked agency himself. But we have seen surprises. I mean, Ahmadinejad was supposed to be a pliant tool of Khamenei as well, and rather quickly developed a very hostile relationship with Khamenei and clearly shown signs of ambitions that went well beyond what the presidency in Iran traditionally has been allowed to have. And he was out there in this election round. First of all, he tried to become a candidate. He was rejected, and then he was urging people to boycott the elections. So Raisi could potentially turn out to be somewhat different from what he has been so far. I wouldn't hold my
Mm-hmm.
breath.
Mm-hmm.
Keep also in mind that Khamenei himself, when he became supreme leader in 1989, it was to a large part because of maneuvering by one of the founders of the revolution, Hashemi Rafsanjani, who later on became president.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears that he wanted Khamenei to become supreme leader because he thought that he would be able to control Khamenei.
Mm-hmm.
And he too was mistaken because Khamenei turned out to be actually quite savvy and capable of outmaneuvering,
Mm-hmm.
rather ruthlessly, of course, Rafsanjani and many of the people that were in his circle.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just jump in and follow up on one point you just made, Trita, that was very interesting. And comparing Raisi with Ahmadinejad. I mean, Ahmadinejad at least had, to some extent, if I'm not mistaken, a base of support in his own right, mostly in the rural areas and the conservative rural areas of Iran, and eventually got a lot of support within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and so on, that made him able to act somewhat independently. Does Raisi have any of that independent support, or is he really totally dependent right now on the clerics and the conservative mullahs?
He actually has a greater degree of support amongst conservatives than I think Ahmadinejad did at the time. Ahmadinejad, to a large extent, was the anti-establishment candidate in the elections in 2005 because he was running against Rafsanjani, who had already been president for 2 terms, was extremely corrupt, had been seen as an enemy of the reformists back in the 1990s. Of course, a lot of things changed since then. So casting a vote for Ahmadinejad was a way of casting a vote against the system. So he managed to come out without having much of that type of a base. He had been governor in the district to the north, but nothing much more than that. Raisi is a bit different. He has been the custodian of the shrine in Mashhad, which is one of the most holy shrines in Shia Islam. He has been a person within the very core of the conservative circles as because of his role in the judiciary. Uh, the campaigning around him by the conservatives have also been quite important, which clearly shows it's a sign of loyalty to the system and to Khamenei, and not just some sort of a protest vote against Rouhani or the reformists or the centrists. And I would like to get into the role of U.S. sanctions in the way that Raisi has been able to rise as well, if if time permits.
Yeah, we will get to that, and you can, if you want to jump in now, or we can hold that for in a couple of minutes. Ray, what do you?
Do you think Raisi, though, has the political legitimacy to lead Iran through the many crises, domestic and foreign, that are facing the country? I mean, after all, despite Ayatollah Khamenei's pleas for a strong voter turnout, more than half of Iranians boycotted the elections, and another 3.7 million who did vote spoiled their ballots.
I think without a doubt, Raisi faces a legitimacy problem.
Mm-hmm.
However, it is not as if the Iranian theocracy is unused to dealing with legitimacy problems. It's been dealing
Mm-hmm.
with legitimacy problems from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, if you had been a president like Khatami or Rouhani that managed to get 70 or so % of the vote, it would be quite different. At a minimum, there would be a strong expression of support for that candidate's strategy, etc., which is
Mm-hmm.
still different from the
Mm-hmm.
idea that people voted for Rouhani because they wanted to give a vote of confidence to the system. That's the narrative that the hardliners have put forward, that voter participation is the legitimization of the system. I think it's quite different than that. I think people are extremely unhappy, but they're faced with very bad options. You could go out on the street and revolt. It would be very high risk. And based on the fact that you did so 40 years ago, you would also have very little control of what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're doing a
Yeah.
revolution, you have very little idea of who you're revolting for. You may know who you're revolting against, but who you're revolting for is a fundamentally different question. So it's high risk, high cost. Participating in the elections is low risk, low cost, may not be as dramatic, but it can bring about change. And given the circumstances that they're in, I think the fact that you have so many times the anti-establishment candidate winning is an indication of the vote actually being cast against the system, but in a way that doesn't risk your life.
Right.
And not the way the vote for Ahmadinejad was a vote against the system.
It was certainly in 2005 and 2009, of course, a very different story. And it's also fascinating. The only time a hardliner tends to actually win an election is when there's either cheating or there's so much manipulation of the ballot or of the spectrum of candidates that people can choose from that leads to low participation rate, which means that you only actually have the hardcore supporters of the system coming out and voting. Having said that, I think we also have to be careful about one thing. Given the analysis that was just presented, it would then also mean that 40 or so percent of the population who go out and vote for someone like Raisi may do so precisely because they truly do support the candidate and the system. Which means that we're not dealing with a system that is so unpopular as the Shah's regime was, for instance, in 1979, in which almost every institution, I mean, people deep in the government were rooting for the revolution. I'm not saying that the Shah's regime was worse than the current regime. I think they're both extremely brutal and extremely severe human rights violators. But this system seems to have a degree of support within a minority of the population that is not an insignificant minority. This is something that oftentimes is difficult to accept because it's painful and it's not something that we necessarily like. Take the situation in Afghanistan. The Taliban would not have been able to survive 20 years and be victorious on the battlefield, mindful of the fact that they were also fighting the greatest superpower the world has ever known, had it not been that for reasons that it may be very difficult for us to understand, that there is a modicum of support for them within Afghan society. It's just a reality. Painful, we don't like it, we shouldn't necessarily like it, but we cannot deny it. And we cannot deny that there is a segment of the population in Iran, not a majority, but a significant minority that actually does support the system and part of the reason why they have been able to remain in power.
How much of that is religion, Trita?
I think a lot of that actually is religion. I think the difference, a key difference, not the only difference, of course, between a military dictatorship that was the monarchy of the Shah and a religious theocracy is precisely the manner in which the religious theocracy can use religion as an instrument of its own influence, an instrument of its own legitimacy, and its instruments of its being able to make its power more durable. I wonder how the situation in Egypt for Mubarak, for instance, would have ended had he not just been a naked secular military dictatorship.
Right.
So it is a factor. I wouldn't say necessarily that it's the most important factor. I wouldn't necessarily say that everyone who's religious in Iran, by definition, supports the system. On the contrary, some of the most potent opposition to the system as a whole comes from the city of Qom, which is the religious headquarters of Shiism in Iran.
Right.
Do you think this low turnout could accelerate the demand for change, including perhaps potential amendments to the Iranian constitution?
It's an interesting question because, as we talked about earlier on, participating in the elections by casting a vote for the anti-establishment candidate was a way of protesting. This time around, it's funny how a lot of people felt empowered by not voting. And felt that now there is pressure on the system in which the system will have to do something to be able to create greater harmony and cohesion within society. It is a threat to the system to have this depth of division. I mean, just take a look at the United States. We're also faced with some rather severe, if not unprecedented, degrees of divisions. And that is ultimately a threat to democracy as a whole. Iran is not a liberal democracy in any sense of the word, but that degree of division is still a long-term challenge. And now Raisi and the government will have to do something to address that issue and try to meet the other side halfway. That is an argument that is being used. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. He may go in and pursue a very harsh policy. He may actually feel confidence that now when he has power, he's actually going to try to meet the other side halfway and do some probably symbolic things. Remains to be seen. Again, part of the reason why it's somewhat difficult to predict is because here's a person who's never, ever, ever, ever won a public vote, has never been elected to public office before. Again, an interesting parallel to the United States, where Donald Trump, after having been a TV reality star, wins an election for the first time in his life.
You're listening to The World, Ideas and Practice, brought to you by the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. Our guest this week is Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, and we're talking about the domestic political and economic situation in Iran. And Trita, you raised the issue of U.S. sanctions, which anticipated my desire to pivot as well to economics, the economic realities of life in Iran and what kinds of political impact that has had. And certainly a major driver of that has been U.S. sanctions since the Trump administration withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal.
Yeah, in 2018, when Trump withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, it had a severe impact on the Iranian economy. The GDP of Iran between 2018 and 2019 over the course of 2 years shrunk 12%. So I want to keep this in spectrum. We're not talking about the growth rates dropping. We're talking about the economy actually contracting. You had 10 million people going into poverty. The number of poor Iranians by international standards was 22 million before, and then 32 million 2 years into the sanctions. What was perhaps most politically decisive is that the middle class in Iran, which is the cornerstone, the bedrock of support for the elements in Iran, whether we call them centrist or reformist, but who do want to have a better relationship with the West, who do believe it's possible, they shrunk from 45% of the population to 30%. They were slashed with 1/3. This happens as a result of some of the most severe sanctions any country ever has endured. And it also ironically happens while the Iranians remain in the nuclear deal. The Iranians were in this bizarre situation in which they were faced with more sanctions once they were in a nuclear deal than they were before they actually negotiated. This has had a dramatic impact on the politics of Iran because this was the first time the United States and Iran actually signed an agreement. There's been plenty of examples, I describe them in my book, in which there's been missed opportunities. The US was ready for an agreement or for diplomacy, the Iranians were not. The Iranians were ready, the US was not. The US made a good gesture, the Iranians failed to respond. The Iranians made a good gesture, the US failed to respond. Plenty of examples. This is the only example in which we actually have an agreement that was signed. It was not carelessly negotiated. It actually took 12 years for the full negotiations, 2.5, 3 years for the last intense period at the end. It was not just the US and Iran. It were several European countries, China, Russia, all involved. It was actually one of the big diplomatic victories of this century to be able to come to such a complex agreement. And all of the worries in the West, of course, was what can we do to make sure the Iranians don't cheat? Well, then it turned out that it wasn't the Iranians that cheated, it was the United States that pulled out. What this did to the conception in Iran that negotiations with the West is your ticket out of economic misery, is your ticket out of sanctions, it's your ticket for reintegrating with the global community. really cannot be overemphasized how devastating it was. The argument that the hardliners used for the last couple of years was you put your faith in Rouhani and the reformists and centrists. You thought that by negotiating a deal with the United States, Iran's economic problems would be resolved. But you were duped twice. You were duped because, on the one hand, you thought that the United States could be trusted, and we warned you the US could not be trusted. But you were also duped by Rouhani and the team because they were so naive in trusting that the United States would not breach the agreement, so that they never prepared a plan B or a plan C in case it happened. And the reason why you have lost your job and you have lost so much of your savings and why your family is starving now is because Rouhani was so naive to trust the US and not prepare for plan B. This argument, this narrative that they've been repeating for 2 years now, if not longer, may not have done a lot in convincing a large number of former Rouhani supporters to go and vote for Raisi now. In fact, when you take a look at the vote numbers that he got 15.7 or so million votes in 2017, and he got 17 million something in 2021. He essentially increased these vote numbers with 2 million. The real story is that Rouhani got 25 million votes in 2017, and the reformist candidate this time around got 2.5 million votes. You had a massive drop of 22 million voters who stayed home, who didn't vote. They didn't turn to Raisi, but they were just completely exhausted and lost faith, not just with the reformists and the idea as to whether they can change Iran from the inside, but also in the idea that that type of a team, that type of approach with the United States will end up working. And I think this is a sad story. Right now, the Biden administration is reviewing sanctions policy. I think it's a very welcome review. We have gone bananas with the manner in which we use sanctions. I hope they also take a look at how sanctions have helped the very anti-democratic forces we say we don't want to help. But in many cases, they clearly have. And I think in this case, had it not been for Trump pulling out of the deal, had it not been for him disproving the idea that negotiations with the United States is a good thing for another country, I don't think we would be in a situation today in which Raisi would be president.
Those 20 million, I'll call them centrists, who voted for Rouhani and then stayed home this time, what do they do? Where are they going to go?
They don't have anywhere to go. They felt, and I fully sympathize, that the candidates on the ballot this time were, I mean, again, this was so clearly designed to make sure that Raisi would win. There were only 2 non-conservative candidates, both of them relatively unknown. And as a result, people didn't feel like there was much of a choice for them. So they stayed home. But there is a narrative amongst them, not all of them, but many of them, that they felt that this was actually empowering because this was a rejection of the system. And now the ball is in Khamenei's court and he has to decide whether he wants to heal the society or not.
How long do you think Khamenei has?
He is 82. He has illnesses not uncommon to people that age. The fact that they wanted Raisi to win in this manner this time around, about desperate effort, probably is an indication that his lifespan is probably coming to an end. But no one can obviously predict exactly when it will happen. There's been a steady prediction by neoconservative pro-regime change crowd in Washington, in which every 6 months or so they declare that they just heard from reliable sources in Iran that Khamenei has died. They've been wrong for a decade, but eventually one time they will be
right. It's like the clock that has stopped. It's always right twice a day. So if Raisi is ultimately a successor to Khamenei, does he rise to that level of his predecessors in terms of his legitimacy and stature?
He doesn't, but at the same time, Khamenei himself was not at that level. Again, part of the reason why there is this narrative, this belief that I think has some evidence for it, that Rafsanjani was elevating Khamenei to become supreme leader, was precisely because Khamenei did not have the stature to be able to replace Khomeini. No one did in the system, but he was clearly below. He wasn't actually a full Ayatollah at the time. And as a result, Rafsanjani could control it. Raisi does not have that stature. He does have a black turban. And if you notice, Rouhani has a white turban. Having a black turban means, inside of Shiism, that you are considered a Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet. For a segment of the population, that does make sense.
We have time for one more question, Ray.
We've been talking about Khomeini, and a relative of Ayatollah Khomeini told the Financial Times recently, and I quote, "People are angry and hurt. You cannot have a spark in a barrel of explosives." Close quote. Is there a barrel of explosives there? Is there a risk of serious violence on the streets?
There certainly is. There already had been in the last couple of years, a couple of really horrible examples of it. Hundreds of protesters reportedly getting killed. Those protests, at least the last one, were driven by economics, which again is in turn driven by a combination of regime economic malpractice, mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions. You cannot, in Washington, there's a desire to eliminate sanctions from the picture. It's just preposterous. You cannot have a contraction of 12% and then just blame it on mismanagement and corruption. Particularly mindful of the fact that the Iranians have been under sanctions for most of the last 40 years. There's never been a crisis of this kind. There's only during this period you had sanctions of this level of intensity. So there definitely is a likelihood for that happening. It all depends on how they manage it. It also depends on what happens in the nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran. If there is a return to it, sanctions are lifted, there is going to be a positive development in the Iranian economy. And at that point, again, it will be up to the government and how it manages it. Will the inflection, would the money be used in ways that just fuels corruption, or will there actually be done in such a manner that the average Iranian starts to feel some of that windfall come to them as well? If they manage to improve the economic situation, I think it reduces the likelihood of violence. That doesn't mean that there isn't that political anger left, that there isn't a desire for political change. But the Iranians are right now in a situation in which the economics is clearly taking precedence over the politics and lack of democracy and manners of that kind, which again is very typical for a population that is under this degree of economic pressure.
And a great deal of that economic pressure and strain on the system is coming as a result of sanctions, which anticipates the second part of our conversation, which we'll have to do another day, Trita, and that is on US-Iranian relations and what it portends for the rest of the region, for Iran, and for the world at large. But unfortunately, Trita, we've run out of time on this conversation. You've been listening to The World, Ideas, and Practice, brought to you by the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council, a nonprofit, nonpartisan forum for education and engagement on world affairs. You can learn more about the Council and its speaker and education programs at www.csworldaffairs.org. Our guest today has been Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. We look forward to having you back, Trita, to continue this conversation and to having you with us in Colorado Springs in person, hooray, hooray, on September 7th. Thank you again, Trita, for joining us.
Thank you again, Trita.
Thank you so much.
Thanks also to the Pikes Peak Library District for providing the recording facilities for this program. I'm Sky Forrester, along with my colleague Ray Raymond, your host for this program. Join us again next month for another edition of The World, Ideas in Practice. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, good day, everyone.